Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Juan Londoño and happy birthday, happy anniversary, happy whatever it is that you can celebrate. I'm in a happy mood, it's the weekend here. I hope you're doing well, I hope you're happy too. Today's video is going to be an interesting one because we are comparing two cameras. One that I have in my hand, the Fujifilm GFX100S, and one that doesn't exist yet. It turns out that Canon has released a rumor and about a new camera, 100+ megapixel full frame camera, digital SLR, and that's the one we're going to be comparing. So you say, how can we compare a camera that doesn't exist with a camera that does exist? Well, we're going to get to all of that, right? And we're going to break down the Canon rumors, how they work. I'll tell you about the site itself, and then we'll move on from there. Before we get started, I know I normally do the water break. Today is tea, actually. I'm a double-fisted drinker today. I have water in one hand, tea in the other. Not what you were thinking, right? So get whatever it is, pause the video and come right back. So like I said, before we go on, let's talk about Canon rumors, okay? So there is an official Canon rumors. There's an official Canon rumors site. It's not anything that Canon controls or runs. It's actually an independent group of people, and it's a pretty cool site. And if you're a Nikon or a Sony person, you're going to find that there are sites for them as well. Sony rumors and Nikon rumors, okay? Actually, all of the major cameras have something like that, right? So how does Canon rumors work? Well, they actually rate their rumors. And let me tell you how that works. I have them written down here. So a CR0 is basically a joke. It's some rumor that somebody put out there and they caught a wind of it and they, put it on their site as basically a CR0 because they have absolutely no confirmation from anyone or anything, okay? A CR1 means it's plausible information from an unconfirmed source. So the information makes sense, right? It might be a sensor or it might be a lens. It might be something that makes sense, that would make sense that, to be coming out, but the source is unconfirmed. So you have to rate it a CR1 for that matter, right? CR2 means good information from a known source. So a CR2 you need to start paying attention to because now it starts to get a little more serious, right? And the final one is a CR3. There isn't a 4 and a 5 or anything like that. The CR3 basically means fact. That means it's confirmed by Canon. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a CR3. We're talking about Canon released a rumor that there is going to be a new camera that will be 100+ megapixels, full frame DSLR, full frame mirrorless. I keep saying this, right? I'm still in the DSLR world. You gotta forgive me for that. It's a full frame mirrorless, right? Like an R5, R6. So let's talk about, first of all, let's talk about what that means to Canon. Which camera body is most likely to inherit this 100 megapixel or 100+ megapixel sensor? If you think about the R1, which is set to come out in 2023, right? It's going to be announced at the end of 2022 this year. Would it make sense for the flagship camera that Canon is going to release to have 100+ megapixels? Well, off the bat, we might say, well, yeah, it's the flagship camera, right? Wouldn't you want to pack it with everything? If you watch other YouTubers that follow Canon and that have been shooting Canon for a long time, as myself, and even some of the friends that I have that shoot Canon, everybody is basically in agreement that it's probably not going to be the R1. Why? Because the R1 is going to be, it's already slated to be jack of all trades, master of all. You can't be a master of all with a 100+ megapixel sensor. Let me tell you why. If you have a 100 megapixel sensor, you can already forget about 20 and 30 frames per second. You can't do that, right? And if this camera, the R1, is going to be, master of all, it's got to be good for weddings, it's got to be good for portraits, it's got to be good for sports photography. You've got to be able to take it out to a Formula One, to a NASCAR, to something like that, right? MotoGP, and you have to be able to shoot 20, 30 frames a second. A baseball game, right? Where you want to catch that precise moment of the ball leaving the pitcher's hand. 20, 30 frames per second, 40 and 50 if you can, you know, take it, why not, right? All of the camera companies are already working on this, lowering the megapixels so they can jack up the frames per second for that reason. That's why cameras like the R3 have less megapixels, so you can jack up 30 frames per second, right? So, and Nikon is doing 120 frames per second, but then they bring the resolution down to like 12 megapixels or something. So there are ways of getting around all this. So that's why it doesn't make sense for a camera like the R1 to inherit this 100 megapixel sensor, because it's going to slow it down too much. This is going to have to be a camera that is mostly designed for stills and has some video capability as well. So the rumor has it that it's going to be like an offshoot of the R5. So call it the R5S, that's what people are calling it, S for special edition, whatever it is you want to call it. Let's call it the R5S for argument's sake, and let's move on with the video. We got the Canon rumors out of the way, so we understand how that works, and we already kind of talked about the camera bodies, right? It's not going to be the R1. The R3 is kind of the baby version of the R1. It's not going to have a 100 megapixel sensor either, right? The R6 is a very special camera. It's awesome for so many things. It's affordable, and that's one of the key things. It's affordable. So the megapixels is probably going to stay somewhere between 20 and 30 for a while, and it's very practical for that reason, right? You don't worry about shooting a wedding and shooting 1,000 or 2,000 pictures and then worrying that it's going to fill up your computer at home or your memory cards, because it's 20 to 30 megapixels. So that's a wonderful camera, and it's great at what it does. But if you need a camera that's going to shoot landscapes that you can enlarge to a wall, right? That you can print wall size. If you're going to do artistic photography, I do artistic nudes, for example, and you want to enlarge those to huge canvases with the lowest loss possible, right? If you're going to do archival photography, like documents that need to be stored in libraries, and you need to photograph each page, you need the highest quality possible, right? This is where you start looking at 100 megapixel cameras. You're not looking at 100 megapixel cameras for, you know, burst rates of 20 or 30 frames per second. And that brings us to the comparison between the R5S and the Fujifilm GFX100S. Before we get going, please, if this video is interesting, if you're getting something out of it, like it down below, subscribe, and please share with anyone you think might like it. Don't forget to be sipping your beverage periodically. Stay hydrated. So before we move on to this comparison, I want to go into sensor sizes so everybody's aware of what this means. We're going to have to talk about something because there's a lot of controversy around this camera, the GFX100S, because Fujifilm decided to call it a large sensor, and it pissed people off to no end. And you got to wonder about people too, right? I guess some people just are always looking for a reason to be upset. But it doesn't matter what you call the sensor. They're telling you what the megapixels are, and they're telling you what the size is. That's all that matters, right? So we're going to go into that though, why the camera is called what it's called, and you're going to see, and you're probably going to agree with me that it makes a lot of sense. And before we can do that, we're going to go into the sensor sizes, right? So of course there's micro 4/3. I wasn't going to discuss this. It's a very, very small sensor, right? If you want to go into cell phones are even smaller typically. Now, some cell phones, you're going to see the specs have a big sensor these days, right? Like the Samsung S22. But the sensor covers all of the cameras. So the sensor sits inside, and each of those lenses sits on top of different areas of the sensor. So that's how that works. It's not really the whole sensor for one image, okay? Typically, each of those little lenses on a cell phone will project an image onto the inside of the cell phone into a very small area. So we're not even going to discuss that, right? Cell phones have a purpose. They're great for photography because you carry them everywhere, and they're always there when you need a camera, right? But if you're going to enlarge anything, if you're going to do any serious photography, a cell phone is out of the picture. So we'll do a video on that to cover the details. So we start with micro 4/3, right? These are typically 16 to 20 megapixel cameras, 20 megapixel being the high end. They're typically 14, 16 megapixels, okay? And the sensor size is 17.3 by 13 millimeters, all right? It's a very small sensor. It has a place. The cameras are smaller, the lenses are smaller, great for street photography, great for carrying if you're hiking, perfect cameras for many, many things, not great for others. Then we go into cropped sensor cameras, right? And I'm going to stick with Canon because they're all cropped a little differently. The crop for Canon is 1.6 is what you multiply the sensor by to get to the full frame equivalent, right? So the Canon cropped sensor is a 22.2 millimeter by 14.8. And those tend to be anywhere between 20 and 30 megapixels, right? I have the camera I'm shooting this with, the Canon M6 Mark II, is a 32.5 megapixel camera. It's a crop sensor, right? Very, very nice camera, sweet for street photography. Still small lenses, so you can do a lot with a small package. From there, we move on to full frame cameras, which have a 24 millimeter by 36 millimeter. Now we're talking a bigger range because these are popular cameras, so they offer a whole slew of different megapixels. Like we talked, the Canon R6 is a 20 megapixel camera, and the Canon R5 is a 45 megapixel camera, right? So we're going to say between 20 and 50 megapixels is the average range for, and I keep saying DSLR. So for full frame mirrorless digital cameras, right? There's a whole slew of variety there for what I mentioned, right? They want to give you versatility, they want to give you flexibility to do many things. These are popular, they tend to be a little more expensive because full frame sensors are bigger sensors. That brings us to this camera, right? And we're going to talk about the details. This is the Fujifilm, and the sensor is called a large sensor or large format. Now, I have to stop here for a second because, well, let's keep going and then I'll go back and I'll describe why this name came about and why so many people are upset, okay? So the Fujifilm large format for this digital sensor on these digital mirrorless cameras is 33 millimeter by 44 millimeter. You see how this is starting to get really big, right? This is a big sensor. This is 102 megapixels specifically. We'll just round it down to 100 megapixels, right? So we're talking about a 100 megapixel sensor, and it's fairly large compared to the full frame. But if we get to medium format, the true medium format cameras that people used to shoot when we were using film, the film was a lot bigger than 33 by 44, what I just mentioned, right? That was called medium format. So it was called medium format because film, 35 millimeter film, was the same as a full frame camera today. It was 24 by 36 millimeters, okay? So when a bigger negative came out, that was called a medium format negative, and that was roughly 60 millimeters by 60 millimeters. Big, very big. Some of them were even bigger than that because they were rectangular. This is a square one that I just read to you, right? So what was large? Well, large was basically a sheet of paper, like a sheet of notebook paper. It was an 8 by 10, like an 8 by 10 picture. That was the size of the negative. So think about this. Large format was like an 8 by 10 negative. Medium format was this 60 millimeter by 60 millimeter, which is 6 centimeters by 6 centimeters, which is about roughly, what is that going to be? I should have done the math before. I'll put it on here in the video so you can see it. So that's a medium format. And then there's the regular film, which was 24 by 36 millimeters. Today, that regular film equates to a full frame camera, a full frame digital camera. Now, why would Fuji name this a large format when obviously medium format from the film days is bigger? It's 60 millimeter by 60 millimeter. This large format is 33 millimeter by 44 millimeter, right? That's what we said? Yes. Well, the reason is Fujifilm didn't want to call this a medium format because they knew people were going to say, wait a minute, medium format in the film days was 60 by 60. How can you call this a medium format? It's only 33 by 44. So Fujifilm said, yeah, we can't do that. We can't call this a medium format. We'll just call it a large format because it's larger than the full frame sensor, right? So there's full frame in the digital world. There's the large, which is this, right? And that's basically what we have right now. We don't have, so there are cameras like the Phase 1 and the Hasselblad, which had slightly bigger sensors, but still not quite the size of the film days medium format, but they were bigger than this, right? and they were calling those medium format. You can get angry at them too and say, hey, wait a minute, it's not 60 millimeter by 60 millimeter. And some people did get mad, but they're bigger than this, okay? And they're 150 megapixels in some cases. But right now, we end with this, this topic of why Fuji call this a large format. So now you know, anytime you hear something, read something, people are pissed off. How can you call this large? It's not even medium. Now you know why, right? They don't want to call it medium because it's not a medium format. Medium format is very big. So they didn't call it really large format. They just call it a large sensor. Really, that's what they're calling it, a large sensor, okay? And it is larger than a full frame. Now we're ready to dive into some of these specs, okay? So the Canon, this Canon R5S that we're talking about, that we think is going to have this 100 plus megapixel sensor, it's probably going to be, if you listen to many photographers, it's probably going to be around the 100 mark, maybe a little more, 110, 105, something like that. Let's just say between 100 and 110 megapixels, okay? The estimated price, they're saying, it's going to be somewhere between $4,500 and $5,000. So let's just say a little under $5,000, okay? If you look at how much information is held in a sensor that has 100 megapixels, it's very difficult to move that information fast from the sensor to the buffers to the card, right? So shooting 20, 30, 40 frames per second is going to be out of the question. Now, Canon has a lot of money. It's a big company. They're a super technology company, and they do a great job at everything they do, right? So I'm guessing if you look at this camera, this is 102 megapixels, large format, right? Sensor, it's a big sensor. It takes pictures at 5 frames per second, right? So what is this Canon R5S going to be? It's probably going to be somewhere between 7 and 10 frames per second, guess, right? That part is not confirmed, that part hasn't been talked about, but you know they're going to be pushing as hard as they can to do better than this, because they're going to want to take this camera down. This is the 100 megapixel baby. If you look at the history of Fujifilm, the first 100 megapixel camera was a lot bigger and heavier than this. So still smaller than a medium format camera from the film days, and also smaller than a Capture One, Phase One, and smaller than a Hasselblad, but bigger than this. Now they have a camera that fits in your hand like a digital SLR, like a DSLR. This is what it feels like. It's bigger than a mirrorless, but it feels wonderful. I mean, great grip, great size, right? Lenses are a little big because the diameter is very big. It's got a very big sensor, but overall, this is just a beautiful size, right? So Canon's going to compete with this. They're going to want to take this down and become the prime seller of 100 megapixel cameras. So like we said, it's going to be about $5,000, maybe a little less, hopefully. Prices are going up now, so who knows, right? But 7 to 10 frames per second is going to be almost double this. This is 5 frames per second. So already that's going to be good. If they can do higher than that, fantastic. There are physical limitations, who knows, right? Eye tracking is going to be Canon. It's going to be one of the best in the field, right? Canon right now is competing with Sony. I don't know which one's at the top. They're both very good. Sony was at the top for a while. Canon took it with the R5. Who knows what's going to happen with Sony? They keep updating their stuff as well. Eye tracking is fantastic in these cameras, right? So Canon's going to do a great job at tracking its subjects. It's going to do body tracking, bird, cars, motorcycles, you name it, it's going to have it. Now, the advantage is Fujifilm just released a new camera in the crop sensor world that has all this. And there are rumors, here we go again with the rumors, that this camera and all their other cameras are going to get those firmware updates, and we're going to be able to do the same with this because the tracking is a little slower. We'll get into that in a minute. Regarding focus, this camera focus is a little slower. The Canon, because it's a Canon, and because they have money and they have the technology already exists and their lenses are very quick, they're going to have faster focusing than this, right? So you're going to get for under $5,000, hopefully maybe no more than a little more than $5,000 in that range, you're going to get a fantastic camera that's about this size, right? Like the size of a digital SLR. That's going to be able to handle 100 megapixels, probably 8K video, you know. For people that are interested in video, I'm sure it's going to have great video. Maybe 8K downsized or downsampled from like 12, 4K or something like that, because there's so much at 100 megapixels. So now that we covered what this new camera has, we know 100 megapixels, and we know it has the lens lineup, the RF lens lineup, and you know, there are certain things we know, the size, right? And then we guessed a few. We're going to compare it to something we have in our hand. So we know the specs here, right? This is a $6,000 larger sensor format, 102 megapixels, 5 frames per second. Tracking, eye tracking, so. We were doing experiments, my friend and I, and you know, sometimes it was perfect, sometimes it missed. You know, you can take it or leave it, it's not great. But for what this camera was designed for, it's perfect, right? This is designed for a studio, for headshots, for portraits, and for landscapes. You don't need this fast, you know, tracking. Also, the lens focusing ability, it's perfect. This is 110 millimeter f2. It's a very special lens for Fujifilm. You have to multiply that by 0.8. It's the other way. It's not by 1.6, because this is a bigger sensor now than full frame. You multiply by 0.8 to get the full frame equivalent. So this ends up being like an 85 millimeter, like f1.3 or something like that, right? Great lens for portraits. Beautiful accuracy. I mean, and how it resolves the 102 megapixels is just to die for, right? But that's another thing. We'll discuss that a little later in the pros and cons, okay? But let's talk about things that we know that we don't know about the Canon, right? This can shoot 16-bit RAW. If you shoot a RAW picture with this camera, 16-bit RAW, it's a 200 megabyte file on your computer. So you really have to be selective about what you're shooting, otherwise you're going to fill up your drive, or you need to have a lot of space, right? Maybe on the cloud or something. It has IBIS, right? 5-axis IBIS. It's got what did I write here? Dual UHS 2 slots, which is fine for what it is, because it's not shooting 20-30 frames per second. So it has phase detect autofocus, but it also uses contrast. It's like a hybrid. It picks which one to use when, depending on what you're doing, right? So in that sense, wonderful autofocus. When it hits, it's perfect, right? That's what I mean. When they come up with the firmware update, it's going to be fantastic. A 12 EV range, which is amazing for dynamic range. 12 EV range. Even the cameras that are worth more than cars, like the Phase 1, which is like a $50,000 camera, the lenses are like $15,000. That's a 13 EV range for dynamic range. This is 12. So you can imagine phenomenal dynamic range, thanks to the big sensor. One of the cool things about any Fujifilm camera is that you have like 19 or so film simulations. This is phenomenal. If you want to shoot in JPEG, for example, you don't want to be worried with those high, megapixel counts. You want to lower that a little bit and compress it. You can use any of the film simulations, which is, think about the film days, right? You can pop any film and it gives you a slightly different hue and contrast, black and white. You can do that with this camera. You can pop in a different film simulation and just go to town. Beautiful. They work well right out of the camera. Exposure compensation in this camera is excellent. It's 5 EVs, not 3. And it's in 0.3 increments, which is fantastic. So that gives you a little bit. There's way more, when you break this camera down. I've been using it now. I haven't done a review on it because I haven't used it enough. I will get enough pictures and video, and so we can do a real thorough review, hopefully in the next month or so. But I'm holding this, right? So I've used it, and I shot Canon for over 30 years, and I love Canon, right? So I think I have enough information to do this review. So now we're going to get into some of the information that you're looking for. Let's talk about the pros and cons of both of these animals, the one that doesn't exist and the Fujifilm, right? Obviously, for the Canon, it's going to have faster frames per second. We talked about that. Even if it's between 7 and 10, it's better than 5, right? Eye tracking is going to be much better. It's Canon. Lens selection, the RF lineup is nice, and it's getting better every day, right? They're going to grow this to like what they did when they had the EF lens mount, right? It's going to be a phenomenal, probably 30, 40 lenses. So you're going to have way huge selection to pick from, which is nice. Accessories for Canons are always there, right? People are always making things for these cameras because there are so many of them. Canon sells more cameras than any other company in the world. So people sell accessories for cameras that sell often, right? It's just very simple. And then the price, it's going to be about $1,000 cheaper than this animal, right? So all of these are nice pros. What are the pros for the Fujifilm? Well, if you care, and I do, I really, really do, craftsmanship. When you hold this camera, I have a 5D Mark III. I've held my friend's R6, my friend's R5. They're great cameras. There's nothing wrong with those cameras. But the feel of this is all metal on the outside. And wherever the fingers go, there's a little bit of rubber. This is just an animal of a camera to hold. It's a beast. And it feels like that, right? It's about 900 milligrams, I think. We don't know what that Canon's going to be, right? But if you care about craftsmanship, they're both going to be water resistant, I'm sure, or weatherproof. Weatherproof, I guess, is the right word, right, to some degree. But this just feels, if you care about craftsmanship, like people that buy Leicas, right? You buy a Leica for a reason. You're paying $5,000 for like a little handheld thing that sometimes doesn't even have a removable lens. But you know why you're paying that, because it's the craftsmanship. Everybody that has one says, I'll never sell my Leica, because they just love the way it feels, and that makes them want to go out and take pictures. That's how I feel with this camera. I just want to hold it. Even when I'm home and I'm just reading or something, I'll just pick it up and hold it because it feels so damn nice. It's just a really, really nice camera. So the craftsmanship, if it matters to you, this takes the cake. I mean, this is the prize winner right there, right? What else? Retro style, if these things matter to you, that's what Fujifilm is known for. I'm going to light this up for you in a second. If you look at this, right, it's got, I'm doing this on purpose here, so you can tell that it's got this, I don't know if you can see that or not, right, but you can move the aperture and the ISO and stuff, so it simulates these rings, right, and you can change that display, by the way. You can make it anything, and by the way, when you turn the camera off, which I just did, that display keeps showing, right? So it's really, really cool. I don't know if you got to see that, but so retro style dials, a lot of settings. You can basically program this thing. It's got buttons everywhere. You can program them for quicker access. It's got 6 custom settings. If you look at this dial right here, if you look at this dial, it's got 6 custom settings. Just so much, right, I can say about this camera. ISO and dynamic range. So the ISO that comes inherent with the camera is 100 to 12,800, but it's expandable to 50 and 102,000, right? So just like the other cameras, but I will tell you, having shot Canon my whole life and shooting some of the new mirrorless Canons now and then shooting this thing, wow. The ISO on this can get so high without it being noticeable in your pictures. It's amazing, probably because of the large sensor and larger pixels. The larger your pixels, the more receptive they are to light. That's why the R6 is a cheaper camera. The pixels are bigger because it's a lower resolution, and people say it's better in low light, right? Less noise than the R5. The R5 is 45 megapixels, so each pixel is tinier, less receptive to light, right? It makes a lot of sense. So this thing is a huge sensor, even though it's 100 megapixels, 102, it just behaves really, really well in low light. And then there's the uniqueness, right? People look at this Fujifilm, what the heck? Like everybody shoots Canon, Sony, right? Nikon. Fujifilm, is that even a thing these days? Absolutely. Their crop sensor cameras are kicking butt right now. And if you look at this thing, they don't do any full frame. They go from crop to this large format. And this is the camera right now in the market. They say for the money, the upper market of cameras, the higher end cameras, this is probably the prize winner, right? If you read all the reviews. So I know Canon's going after that market, so will Sony. Cons, let's talk about cons for a minute. What are the cons from something like a Canon 100 megapixel camera? Well, it's going to look like every other Canon, which is just this big, massive rubber monster, right? If you don't care about that, you just care about functionality, that's not an issue, right? If you do, obviously that matters. And that's when I talk about not having a soul. You've heard me say that before, why I'm switching slowly from Canon to Fujifilm. I still have Canon gear. I'm recording this on a Canon, right? The M6 Mark II. I still have my 5D Mark III. I use it a lot. but these cameras all look alike, and the more the new ones come out and they continue to look like that, the more I feel like, you know, everything's in the menu, they're clean on the outside. I feel like they lack a little soul, right? When you look at this, it's full of buttons everywhere, it has dials. You know, the lens is where you select the aperture, right? You select it on the lens by moving the ring, right? That's like the old cameras. Just, it gives you that feel. Everything's tactile, right? So those are the cons for something like the Canon. You know, dynamic range might be a con. I didn't put it on there, but you know, a smaller sensor is going to have a smaller dynamic range, and maybe 100 megapixel out of a full frame. Maybe it's not going to be so good with low light, because the pixels are going to be so tiny that they're not going to be very receptive to light. So those are the cons. Now, what are the cons of this, you know, beautifully crafted beast, right? I'm going to say, because it's not a rubber beast. Slower lenses, we already talked about that, right? The eye tracking is not as great. And then of course it's going to be about $1,000 more. So, and the lens lineup, you know, they continue coming up with lenses for this mount, and they will continue to, but not at the rate that Canon is going to produce RF lenses. I mean, let's just face it. So now we're at the point, who benefits from each of these cameras? I think we talked a little bit about this, right? Water break. Who benefits from these? Well, who benefits from the Canon, right? $1,000 cheaper. So obviously, if you don't have $6,000, but you can wiggle finding $5,000, and many times that's the case, right? We can borrow $5,000 from a credit card, but we can't borrow $6,000. If money's an issue, the Canon's going to be better for you, right? If you're already a Canon shooter and you already have RF lenses, if you have an R6, for example, or an R5, and you're dying to buy this 100 megapixel monster because you need it for your landscape or for enlargements or whatever it is, right? You already have 3 or 4 lenses. It might make more sense for you to move into that frame, right? Than buying a whole new frame, selling your lenses and stuff like that, right? It just is, right? It makes more sense. Who else might benefit? Well, if you're familiar with just Canons in general and you're one of those people that doesn't like to change a whole lot or very often, then you're moving into the lineup you already know. You already know what the menus look like. Personally, I love, I can't say it enough, I love Canon menus. They are so well laid out. I teach photography. I've gone through the Nikon menus. They're okay. They're not bad by any means, they're okay. The Sony, I don't even want to say anything about Sony menus. And then of course Fujifilm, now that I moved into, they're actually very nice and very easy to understand. They're just different from the Canon, but I think they're equally well laid out. So being a Canon shooter for over 30 years, I think the Canon menus are just more intuitive, right? They just make more sense to me. But if you're a Fuji shooter and you've been a Fuji shooter for a while, then maybe the Fujifilm menus will make more sense to you. They're equally well laid out. So the only other one I can think of is if you're shooting for money, right? If you're shooting for money, that means like weddings and things like that. You're running around, you might be chasing a bride. This is going to be a camera that will have a little more difficulty locking onto your target than something like the Canon, right? So at least for now, until they upgrade the firmware, maybe in another month, this won't be an issue anymore. But in general, right? You know, the eye tracking and body tracking and all that stuff, vehicle tracking, the Canon is going to be it's going to have an edge because they're competing between Sony and Canon on that, and they're already like way above everybody else. So Fujifilm is getting there. They did, like I told you, with the new crop sensor camera that just came out. It has phenomenal eye tracking, right? And it's going to move into all this. But for now, Canon is going to be the better one for that. If you're making money off your camera and you rely on quicker focusing, quicker lenses, stuff like that, you're probably going to rely more on that Canon because it's going to let you do different things. The minute you have to go to a sports event with this, you might feel like, oh my gosh, I can only do 5 frames per second. If the Canon ends up doing 10 frames per second, it's already double, right? It's already twice as good. And there was a time not too long ago when 5 frames per second was phenomenal, 10 was exceptional. So we're just getting spoiled too, right? We're up at 30, 40. And it just keeps getting better and better. And there's no reason we shouldn't demand more. That's what we do as consumers, right? And we're willing to pay for that. But let's be honest too, right? 10 frames per second is going to be very nice for 100 megapixels if they can pull that off. On the other end, who benefits from this? Well, we already talked a little bit about that as well, right? It's a slower workflow. So it's a camera for a slower workflow. This isn't a slower workflow, it's a camera for a slower workflow. So my workflow now, I do black and white nudes. You know, I'm sitting there or standing, shooting a picture, planning it, you know, composing it. I'm not in a rush, right? Neither is the model. I'm doing landscapes. Most of the time, I'm not trying to race to get something. I'm laying there, or I've got my tripod set and I'm sitting there, standing there. I'm walking on a beach, right? So it's a slower workflow. When I do portraits, which I love doing, by the way, it's a slower workflow typically, right? You set everything up, you have everything ready, and then you just enjoy yourself with the model, with the person, and you have a good time, right? So if you're working a slower workflow, this is an ideal camera because it's made for that. That's its purpose. It's got knobs, dials everywhere. You can fine tune everything and adjust it very quickly. So it's wonderful. Who else benefits from this Fujifilm? The larger sensor is going to give you better dynamic range. If you want to rescue information from those dark shadows and from those bright skies and get some of those clouds back, even though you don't see them in the picture, 12 EVs of dynamic range is phenomenal in any camera, right? So if that matters to you, the Fujifilm is going to be the camera to go with, right? And if you're worried about ISO, working in low light, this thing, I can tell you because I've used it, is crazy, crazy amazing. I've shot in very low light, and when we do the review on this camera, I'm going to show you. And then I go in my computer and I start looking for grain and I don't see it, and I just don't, it doesn't register in my mind how you can shoot at 6400 and not see any grain. I'm used to seeing some grain, right? Even in a good camera. And then most cameras like that M6 Mark II, it's got such a small sensor. At 6400, the grain is terrible, even out in the daylight. Because I was just in New York and I saw that. But this camera, holy cow, it's amazing. And if you like that exclusivity we talked about, if you like owning something that, let's face it, I mean, let's get this out of the way, the elephant in the room, right? Why do people buy Lamborghinis and Ferraris? Because they can. Because they don't want to drive what everybody else drives. They don't want to own a Camry, a Ford Fusion, or a Honda Accord, right? These are all good cars, by the way. We own a Ford Fusion. Honda Accords, Camrys, these are reliable cars that you can drive for like 300,000 miles. But if you have $10 million in the bank, buy yourself a Ferrari. Why wouldn't you buy something that nobody else has, right? Exclusivity. People pay for that, right? This is exclusivity. This is you walking around with something that's extremely well built with pride, because Fujifilm takes a lot of pride in these GFX cameras, and it's that exclusivity, right? I've always liked having things, and it doesn't have to be an expensive thing, just just having things that not everybody else has, right? I had a Hyundai Veloster because that car wasn't popular when they came out. I had that because it was different on the road, and it was a great car, by the way. Not just, I won't buy something different that sucks. It's got to be good, right? So I love exclusivity, whether it's a car, a camera, whatever it is, a pen, you pay for that. And it feels good to own it when you can, right? So if you're into that stuff, if you're into craftsmanship, then you're going to benefit from owning this Fujifilm. It just feels like no other camera I've ever held. And that's it. That's basically, we've approached the end of this video. We're at the conclusion. So I hope you liked it. I hope it made a lot of sense. It did to me when I was playing it out. Let me know if it doesn't, if I'm crazy, if whatever you think, right? I do get these comments often. So the GFX100S has been already, I'm looking at this because I was reading something that said it's the best value in the high-end camera segment. But will Canon knock it out? It's coming out with a camera that's 100 megapixels, that's a grand cheaper with more lens selection, faster focusing, better eye tracking. There's a lot of benefits to this Canon that's going to come out. Is it going to be the R5S? Who knows? Maybe they'll come up with another number like the R4 or something like that, right? Whatever it is, I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to hold it. I can't wait to shoot it. I can't wait to compare it to this. But for now, that's all we have. We have Canon rumors versus a real monster. So let me know what you think in the comments. Which one will you be buying? And you know what? Maybe neither of these two cameras make sense to you, right? If you're shooting only weddings and you need 20 to 30 megapixels and 100 megapixels is just way too much for you, then obviously this is not even a topic for you, right? But it's good that you stuck around because you learn something every day, right? And if you do ever need something like a 100 megapixel camera, you're gonna have the basis to make that decision quickly. So I love you guys. I hope you continue doing well. Please take care of yourselves so we can meet back up here in a week. Until the next video, ciao for now. That's it, we're done. Dun 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 dun. I hope it came out well, I hope it sounds good.